So the major communication method in the brain is through a process called neurotransmission. This is how neurons communicate with one another, how they transmit their electrochemical signals. So I'm going to talk a little bit about neurotransmission and some of the issues involved in that. There are some major neurotransmitters that we need to talk about and you should know about, including glutamate, GABA, dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, sometimes what we call the monoamines, and acetylcholine. I'm also going to talk briefly about endogenous opioids and the endogenous cannabinoids because they're of some contemporary issue and debate. So neurotransmitters work like a lock and key. The key is the neurotransmitter, the chemical compound itself, and it binds to a specific receptor, like a key goes into a lock. Only the right key goes into the right lock, so dopamine doesn't bind with serotonin receptors, and glutamate doesn't bind with norepinephrine receptors, but only certain compounds bind with those specific receptors. Now, what the receptors do is that when the binding occurs, the actual receptor, which is a sort of protein in and of itself, changes. It changes in some ways very dynamically. And what it primarily does is control ion channels. And ions are little charged particles both in and outside of the neuron or the cell. And they are positively and negatively charged. So the electrical activity of a neuron is controlled by the status both inside and outside, the electrical status of the inside versus the outside of the particular cells. So when we say a neuron fires, when there's an action potential, what that means is that it goes from negatively charged to positively charged cell. So ionotropic receptors are receptors that directly control an ion channel, a channel for ions to come in and out of the cell, whereas a metabotropic receptor is one in which it needs some other processes. So in an ionotropic or ligand-gated, we call them, receptor, this is an NMDA receptor of the glutamate, so this is a glutamate receptor. We have the extracellular side, or the outside of the cell, and we have the inside of the cell represented down here. And these little bubbles and stuff represent the membrane of a neuron. Okay, it's sort of walls. The cell walls, if you will, are made of this. We often represent it much like this. You can see it over here. This is a receptor, and it spans the membrane, so that when glutamate comes in and binds, it controls directly this tube or this channel that allows some ions to go in, some to go out, and so on and so forth. This is a metabotropic or secondary messenger receptor. This is a 7-transmembrane receptor. This is a dopamine receptor. And what happens is the dopamine comes in and maybe binds at one of these little Y's here, changes literally the physical and electrical dynamics of this cell, of this protein, I'm sorry. Thus, certain things are released on the intracellular side. And what those things do, or those are often what we call Gproteincoupled receptors, they release particular amino acids or proteins that then produce their effects on ion channels nearby. So ligand-gated ion channels or ionotropic receptors, when the receptor binds, it controls directly an ion channel. But G-protein-coupled receptors are metabotropic receptors. When the receptor binds, it has to do something else in order for ions to flow through a channel. Now, the major neurotransmitters in the brain begin with glutamate, and it's the primary excitatory neurotransmitter. That means that when glutamate is present, the likelihood that a neuron will fire increases. The likelihood that an action potential will travel down the axon is increased. That's what we mean by excitation. There are a number of receptors: the NMDA receptor, the AMPA receptor, L-type voltage-gated receptors are glutamate receptors. NMDA is a critically important receptor in the brain because we know it's critically important in learning and memory. Sensory processing is all glutamatergic as well. Glutamate is involved in almost all the sensory processing that we do. So messages from your eyes, ears, nose, fingertips, tongue, and so on. Those are all excitatory glutamate-coded messages that you're receiving in the brain. The drugs that affect glutamate systems include alcohol, and that's why some people have trouble remembering what happened after they drink, because it's affecting one of the memory systems of the brain. And another food additive, the food additive MSG, which some people claim gives them headaches, is probably acting on the glutamate system. MSG stands for monosodium glutamate and is in fact very similar to the glutamate that's in your brain. The data on this issue, MSG is popularly or commonly added to Chinese food, but it's found in all sorts of foods, and derivatives and things like it are in a lot of foods as well. But you also see at the grocery store things like soy sauce that says no MSG added, and it's really a false claim that MSG gives people headaches or they're sensitive to it or something like that. It's probably something else that's going on. GABA is the primary inhibitory neurotransmitter, and inhibition means that when GABA is present, the likelihood that we'll get an action potential decreases. It makes it harder for the neuron to fire. There are two classes of receptors, GABA A and GABA B receptors for the transmitter and neurotransmitter GABA. One's ligand-gated, the other's metabotropic. It's involved in sensory processing, learning, memory, and consciousness, and we know this because the sedative effects of alcohol largely are actions through GABA receptors. And we also know the anti-anxiety agent Valium, which is in a class of drugs called benzodiazepines. This also has some sedative effects. You might, if you're having surgery, I had minor knee surgery, I was given a sedative like Valium that relaxed me and went through the surgery on that. So we know those act on the GABA system. Dopamine, you've probably heard of, we abbreviate it DA, is a monoamine. And while your book doesn't call it a neuromodulator, most neuroscientists would call it a neuromodulator. And what that means is it doesn't have any direct effects. In some cases, it does. I should take that back. But in many cases, its actions are really influencing what glutamate and GABA do, as well as other neurotransmitters. Their receptors are metabotropic. They're Gproteincoupled receptors, and they're numbered D1 through 5. D1 and 5 tend to be excitatory, and D2, 3, and 4 tend to be inhibitory. Dopamine system is involved in learning and memory. It's involved in the reinforcing actions of drugs and food and special things. It's also involved in movement and action, and so on. We know that many of the drugs that have antipsychotic properties act on the dopamine system, especially the dopamine 4 receptors. Thorazine, thyroxine do that. Anti-Parkinson drugs, Parkinsonian drugs, like L-Dopa, act on the dopamine system. In fact, we know that Parkinson's disease is decimation of the dopaminergic system in cell bodies in the substantia nigra. Many of the ADHD meds that are commonly used in this country, Ritalin and Adderall, affect the dopamine system, as well as cocaine, amphetamine, including crystal meth, and almost all drugs of abuse in one way or another impact the dopamine system. Adderall is an amphetamine. That should be pretty clear, or I should make that clear. So amphetamine and ADHD meds, we often have to be careful about dosaging and so on and so forth, because a little really helps, but a lot makes you an addict, So another neuromodulator or monoamine that we talk a lot about is serotonin. We abbreviate serotonin 5-HT because its chemical name is 5-hydroxytryptamine. It has receptors that are both metabotropic and ligand-gated, and the receptors are named 5-HT for that chemical name of serotonin, 5-hydroxytryptamine. And often they have sub number and letters. So, for example, 5-HT2A is a type of receptor whose ligand, which is the drug that binds to it, we call that that's what a ligand is. Serotonin is a ligand for 5-HT2A receptors. There are at least 14 different receptors in the human brain for serotonin. Its functions include learning and memory, anxiety, and mood. Drugs that affect the serotonin system include tricyclic antidepressants like Elavil, but also the SSRI antidepressants, the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor antidepressants, Prozac, Zoloft, etc. It's used in anti-anxiety treatment. Some of the drugs are anti-migraine. These are migraine meds as well. And a drug of abuse that affects serotonin system is LSD. Norepinephrine, we abbreviate NE. It is the third of the monoamines that we talk about. It is also a neuromodulator, so it influences the actions of GABA and glutamate and other neurotransmitters. But then norepinephrine has a special function regarding vasoconstriction and vasodilation, and that is the expansion and contraction of your blood vessels. So the receptors are metabotropic. They're called adrenergic receptors after the fact that adrenaline is also an endogenous ligand for these, meaning that adrenaline can bind to these receptors. So we call it the adrenergic system, and that includes adrenaline and noradrenaline. Another name for noradrenaline is norepinephrine. Why that we have all these names for these things, I don't know. But epinephrine and adrenaline are the same as is norepinephrine and noradrenaline. The two classes of receptors are called alpha and beta. It's involved in arousal and alertness. It's a flight or fight response. It's involved in muscle contraction and readiness, and vasoconstriction and vasodilation. Epinephrine or EpiPens, the drug that's in EpiPens, it affects the norepinephrine system or the NE system. And ADHD drugs, we know Ritalin and Adderall also affect this system, and maybe even importantly so. There's a new drug on the market called Strattera. Its chemical name is atomoxetine. It is used to treat ADHD. Acetylcholine is the sixth, really, of the major neurotransmitters. It's a neuromodulator as well, and it influences actions again, but it is also the primary excitatory neurotransmitter for muscles. So at the junction between neurons and muscles, the neurotransmitter that's involved in those synapses is acetylcholine. We abbreviate it ACH. There are two receptors. One is called the nicotinic receptor, or the nicotinic receptor class. The other class is called muscarinic. Nicotinic receptors are ionotropic, muscarinic are metabotropic. It's involved in learning and memory, attentiveness, sleep, muscle contraction, eating, palatability, a bunch of things. The drugs that affect it are obviously nicotine. We named the receptor, neuroscientists named the receptor after the compound in tobacco that binds with these receptors. Scopolamine is another drug. It was used. It was given to women during pregnancy or during birth because it induces something we call twilight sleep. That's affecting the acetylcholine system. Okay, another important neurotransmitter in the brain are what we call endogenous opioids. I think I spelled it wrong. Opioids are technically neuropeptides. They're also neuromodulators. That means they influence the actions of other systems. Opioid receptors are ligand-gated metabotropic receptors, and we name them with Greek letters. So we call them the delta or kappa or mu or zeta receptor. And its primary functions is in pain, in what we call nociception. And that is the perceivability or pain. So it may also be involved in reinforcers or reinforcing actions or reinforcing events. It's probably also involved in food palatability. The drugs that affect the endogenous opioid system include morphine and codeine and heroin. There are a number of synthetic opiates that are now available, like Percocet and Vicodin and those sorts of things. Those activate the opioid system. And naloxone is a drug that blocks the actions of opiates. So if somebody's overdosing on heroin, for example, sometimes they're given naloxone or naltrexone, which removes the heroin molecules from the receptors and binds to them. And the last class that I wanted to talk about were the endogenous cannabinoids. There are a couple of receptors. These are ligand-gated, again, metabotropic receptors. They're numbered 1 and 2, so CB1 for cannabinoid 1 and cannabinoid 2. Cannabinoid 1 receptors are largely found in the central nervous system, while the CB2 receptor is found in the peripheral nervous system, primarily in the gut. And believe it or not, in your gut, so to speak, in your digestive tract, you have about 500 million neurons, nerve cells determining important things. Its functions largely seem to be memory and involved in food and palatability and mood and so on and so forth. And the major drug that affects this system is THC, or delta 9 tetrahydrocannabinol, which comes from pot, which comes from weed, from cannabis. That we do have an endogenous or homegrown or homemade sort of in our brain neurotransmitter called anandamide, which binds with the CB1 and CB2 receptor to do their actions. So hopefully there are other neurotransmitters in the brain, and they're all pretty interesting. Got an interesting story with that. I think we hit on about 8 of the really important ones. Hopefully that helps you with neurotransmission and some of the neurotransmitters involved.